Hey, welcome back to the channel. My name is Mark. This is Command the Raven. The Guard at the Tomb. As we've gone through the Easter season, I began to look at the argument for the resurrection and all the different facets of it. And of course, being a classical apologist, I go through all of these different arguments from natural theology to demonstrate that God exists, or it's more probable that God exists. And you don't have to know all of these, and I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but I began to look at the resurrection argument once again. And of course, like many apologists, they adopt the minimal facts arguments. I know that there's a conversation going on between apologists online, like Testify and Lydia McGrew, regarding should we be going that route, or should we be going a maximal data as opposed to minimal data account. So we're not going to touch on that. But for now, I'm still sticking with the minimal facts argument. Here are 4 facts of the resurrection: that Jesus was crucified. He was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. His tomb was discovered empty by his women followers. The disciples had experiences in which they believed they saw the risen Jesus alive. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and like to my channel. I would really, really appreciate it. It would really, really help me out if you like the content. Just some quick facts on the notes of the empty tomb. I'm not going to defend the empty tomb, but I'm just going to pick out one little facet of an argument within a line of arguments for the empty tomb. One thing to note about the empty tomb is that the narratives in the Gospels, they're remarkably restrained, which means they're absent of prophecy proof texts. There's nothing that says that he was buried with the rich, or that he was buried with, he died with wicked men, or anything like that. It just has a simple narrative. There's no talk of the ascension of Jesus' spirit, what happens in those 3 days while he's in the tomb, or his descent into hell. The nature of the risen body, there's no real discussion regarding that until the gospel narratives unfold. There's no talk of this is the inbreaking of God's kingdom, something that Jesus has continually talked about throughout his ministry. That's absent, and also any Christological titles and trying to elevate Jesus' status and attach it to the empty tomb. Here are 7 quick reasons why the tomb was empty. First of all, what can be called the Jerusalem factor. The passion event of Christ happened in Jerusalem. He was crucified, died, and was buried, and rose again. And the apostles started the church. Essentially, their HQ, their headquarters, was in Jerusalem. It would have been quite easy for the Jewish leaders to disprove the resurrection by just pointing at the rotting corpse of Jesus behind a tomb, but they could not do that. The second thing that's really strong is that the women in all 4 Gospels were the unanimous witnesses of the empty tomb, the burial as well, and the resurrection of Jesus in first century Palestine. Women would have not been credible as witnesses, and this adds further strength. And the fact that it was written later, in number 3, their gospel traditions are later than Paul. In Paul's letters and in Acts, there's hardly any mention of the women. They just thought maybe it might be a little bit more counterproductive to include them, but later on that they did. Paul implies an empty tomb in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4, and he was buried. And he was raised on the 3rd day, according to the scriptures. Buried and empty implies an empty tomb, or buried and raised implies an empty tomb. Acts 13 is an early tradition. Paul had just come from preaching on Cyprus with some interesting things happening. And he explicitly goes through Abraham, he goes through Moses, Judges, and to David, and eventually gets to Jesus. And specifically, he mentions the tomb was found empty and Jesus was risen alive from the dead. And 6 is what we're going to look at today. The Jewish hierarchy acknowledged the empty tomb and the missing body. And of course, the resurrection is clearly a bodily notion. Why would you put a guard at the tomb unless it was a bodily resurrection, right? So, and if you want more on that, try and get a book called The Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright. I'll have a few quotes later, 700 pages only. It's a light read. And to answer one question today, hopefully for you and for me, is the guard story in Matthew only an apologetic legend? In other words, did Matthew invent it? The guard of the tomb story. Here are our outcomes today. I'm going to read portions, only portions of the guard of the tomb story in interest of time. The 3 skepticisms and 1 excursus. We're going to look at the Gospel of Peter and compare it to Matthew's Gospel. And we'll do an argument, counter-argument assertion at the end, and hopefully this becomes very clear. And Matthew's Gospel 27:62. Starting at 62, here we go. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he had been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting a guard. Skipping ahead, an angel appears, rolls away the tomb. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this day. This last verse is why we're looking at the guard of the tomb story a little bit more closely. And the 3 skeptical reasons, of course, why many historical critics don't accept this story is it's not in the other Gospels. Why leave it out if it's so important? Jesus predicted his death and resurrection, which in many camps seems very dubious. I don't think so. And 3, it presupposes that the Jewish authorities understood Jesus rising from the dead, while his disciples did not. Let's kind of untie these naughty skeptical reasons as best we can. The first one's pretty simple to deal with. It's just the fact that it's not in the other Gospels is a typical argument from silence. Gospel writers often inexplicably omit lots of significant details that the other Gospels record. Think of Jesus walking on the water. Why on earth would you exclude that from your Gospel? But some of them did, like Luke's Gospel. And another thing as well is when you're writing a Gospel or writing in the ancient world and you have some papyrus, like I have here, I got this from Egypt. You get what you get and you write down what you're writing down. And so you better know what you're talking about. So it would have taken a process for them to figure out what they were writing down for their Gospel to be told and how they wanted to tell it. Matthew's Gospel, again, is the only Gospel that mentions this account, which means that it didn't come from Mark, didn't come from Luke, and which means that Matthew is getting it from another tradition. And if Matthew is writing this a little bit later, like say in the 80s AD, around there, we're just going by the standard dating, which I don't think is necessarily a problem. I'm going by the 2-source hypothesis that Mark and Q, won't get into that, but Mark was written first. Both Matthew and Luke drew from Mark's Gospel, and yet the guard of the tomb story is not there. So the question is, why is it there? A quick excursus as we're moving along the way here. The Gospel of Peter. I know many of my listeners probably won't be familiar with what is the Gospel of Peter. Is that after Acts or something? No, the Gospel of Peter is an apocryphal pseudepigrapha gospel, which is from the late 2nd century. Essentially, apocryphal, which means hidden or secret, and pseudepigrapha, which means falsely under or falsely attributed to, meaning that it's the Gospel of Peter, but no one thinks it's the real Peter that it would have written it. So there are many of these type of works from the 2nd and 3rd century. And it's an exciting discovery that happened in the late 19th century where the Gospel of Peter manuscript and portions of other manuscripts were discovered in a monk's tomb. Our first mention of the Gospel of Peter comes from the 4th century church father Eusebius, and he gives an extended account, which I'll explain here. The reason why I'm talking about this is because the Gospel of Peter has a tomb mention of a guard at the tomb story. First, the bishop of Antioch, named Serapion, in 199, had Antioch under his watch, and also just southern Turkey, a place called Rosas. And at first, members of the congregation said, "Hey, we've got this." Came to Serapion, "Hey, we've got this gospel. We're going to start to read it." And like any good pastor, he's very happy to see that his church is self-sufficient, and then they're looking after each other with teachings. And he gives them the thumbs up. "Hey, Gospel of Peter sounds pretty legit. Go ahead." Until later on, many people from the congregation of Rosas started to come to Serapion and started to complain and say, "Hey, this gospel's got some weird stuff in it. We're not sure about this." So then, upon further inspection, it was not allowed and was rejected for being just a little bit dangerous in its teaching, kind of leaning heavily on heretical teachings of Docetism. So essentially, Docetism is that Christ is so divine that he could not be human, that Jesus literally was only a phantasm, which creates all kinds of problems, which if Jesus is dying for the sins of humanity and he's not a human, how could he die? And if he didn't die, how can he die for the sins of the world? You see all kinds of problems we get into. And the second type of Doceticism is Jesus and Christ are separate beings, meaning that Jesus is a human and Christ is kind of like this divine spirit person. And one proof text for them is that Jesus dies on the cross and says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" At which point they would say that the divine Christ has left Jesus. And of course, that causes all kinds of problems. And of course, how could Jesus die for sins of humanity and yet not really die? It's just all really strange. So anyway, that's the Gospel of Peter. And to compare the Gospel of Matthew with this guard of the tomb story, with the guard of the tomb story at the Gospel of Peter. Matthew's written 80-85, Gospel of Peter's 150, closer to the 200s. The guard in the Gospels of Matthew is kind of ambiguous. It could be arguments for both Jewish and Roman. I'm leaning more towards Jewish, but that's not a problem here to discuss. Explicitly in the Gospel of Peter, it's a Roman guard. And not only are the guard there, but Pilate's there. The Jewish leaders are at the tomb. The scribes are there. Scribes is written wrong there. Elders, the countryside, and all the onlookers, and they seal it 7 times over. And everybody's there. And when Jesus appears, man, it is quite the scene. As Dr. William Lane Craig notes, for the way a truly apologetic legend handles this story, see the Gospel of Peter. The scribes, the Pharisees, and elders go on Friday to Pilate, who gives them a Roman guard. Together the soldiers, the scribes, and the elders proceed to the sepulchre, and they all roll the great stone across the entrance of the tomb, seal it 7 times, and keep watch. On Sunday morning, Jesus himself is seen coming out of the tomb with the 2 angels, and the witnesses include not only the soldiers and the elders, but also a crowd from Jerusalem and the countryside who had come to see the sepulchre. This is a fail-safe apologetic, no doubt. And commenting on the Gospel of Peter and kind of the nature of it, there's John Dominic Crossan has argued that this is one of the first Gospels which the 4 canonical Gospels are using. And Craig Evan notes, it is far more probable, however, that Peter at every stage of its composition derives from the New Testament Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Matthew, on the dubiousness of the thesis that Peter is early and that the passion source of which the New Testament Gospels are based. D. Moody Smith asks rhetorically, is it thinkable that the tradition began with the legendary, the mythological, the anti-Jewish, and indeed the fantastic, and moved in the direction of the historically restrained and sober? Prudence demands a negative response to Smith's questions. That seems about right. And we have 4 categories of the predictions of Jesus, predicting that he would die, predicting that he would rise again. They can be kind of clumped into 4 things. And a lot of these are in front of the Jewish leaders, not only just to the disciples. Jesus is very explicit. The sign of Jonah sayings in Matthew and Mark, In fact, in the second one, I believe in Matthew's, the people say, "Jesus, give us a sign." And it says Jesus lets out a great sigh and says, "Why do this wicked generation will ask for a sign?" And he says, "No sign will be given." But the other sign says that just as Jonah was in the belly of a big fish, so the Son of Man will be in the earth for 3 days and 3 nights and will rise again. The destruction of the temple, Jesus says, "Destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days." And in fact, many of these scriptures that I have here, the Jewish elders are trying to pin a charge on Jesus. Someone hears that he said something like this, so they want to be able to say he's kind of an insurrectionist. And also that a lot of these scriptures here are from when Jesus is on the cross and the people are jeering him, saying, "Hey, this guy once said that he was destroy the temple in 3 days, but he can't even save himself on the cross. If you're truly the Son of God, bring yourself down." They should wait around for a little bit and they'll find out. The Son of Man sayings is Jesus' favorite self-designation of himself, relying upon Daniel and Ezekiel, this apocalyptic Son of Man story that the Son of Man will be. Who do you say that the Son of Man is? These are surely authentic sayings because the church didn't pick up on these sayings. And the appearances in Galilee. Jesus says, "I will die, and in 3 days I will reappear, and I will meet you ahead. I'll meet you disciples again in Galilee." And did Jesus predict, of those, we just went through the categories, but did he actually predict his death? I think absolutely it can be shown. John the Baptist's death was a clear indication that if you're going to, that Jesus was on a collision course with his mission, that he did anticipate his violent death because John died for righteousness' sake. The parable of the wicked tenants, or the parable of the vineyard, where Jesus is literally claiming himself to be the inheritor, the king, the ruler of the temple, where he is the legitimate owner, and that the hired hand, the Jerusalem, the Jewish Pharisees would kill him and put him to death. Jesus tells that story, and everyone clearly understands what he's talking about, especially the Jewish leaders. The Gethsemane prayer in the garden, Jesus in Mark's gospel appears to be very frightened and reluctant to go to death, obviously. And he says, "My Father, if not, take this cup from me." But then he says, "But not my will be done, but yours be done." And in John's gospel, he is a little bit more dignified. This is certainly authentic for Jesus. Jesus says, "Take up your cross and follow me." And ironically, Jesus fails to do this himself. And Simon, the Cyrene, is end up carrying the cross, the way for him. Surely you wouldn't put that in a gospel if Jesus should have carried his cross or did carry his cross, but he failed to. And of course, there are many Jewish models for suffering in this time frame. One thinks of the Maccabean martyrs giving their speeches, clearly understood that they would be vindicated for suffering for righteousness' sake against the Greeks. Did Jesus predict his resurrection? Jesus believed in the resurrection of the dead. That's pretty clear, along with many Jews like the Pharisees. After 3 days, or on the third day, is a clear motif that is throughout the Old Testament and clearly comes from Hosea 6:2. There's a strong tradition of pious Jews expecting vindication through resurrection. Now, the Jewish authorities. Matthew's sign of Jonah sayings has a resurrection prediction made in the presence of Jewish leaders. It's very clear. And how do the Jewish authorities actually know? Well, it's an argument from silence once again. We don't exactly know how the Jewish leaders did know, but we certainly know that they heard him. If they understood, they would have had difficulty literally understanding, a lot like the disciples. Theologically, it would have been a joke to them, quite frankly. But again, there's all kinds of ways. Did Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus, talk about his mission as well and what he was going to do? And they clearly understood that something was going to happen. And his disciples. Now, the disciples kind of should deserve a break in one sense, because clearly they're clueless on a lot of things. But it's not that they couldn't literally understand what Jesus is saying, but just that they couldn't make any sense of it exactly. And second of all, Jesus is being arrested in front of them, and being tried. They're frightful for their lives. That's the first thing they're thinking of, and they just flee. Jesus' predictions are ex ecclesia. The predictions don't have the church language reading back into the text. There's no proof of prophecy, and the Son of Man title is not something that the church used. If the guard had not existed, then the Jewish polemic or the Jewish attack would never have taken the course that it did. Why? Dr. Craig notes, in the first place, it seems unlikely that the Christians would invent a fiction like the guard, which a great many, especially their Jewish opponents, would realize it never existed. Since the Jewish-Christian controversy no doubt originated in Jerusalem, it is hard to understand how Christians could have tried to refute their opponent's charge with a falsification, which would have plainly been untrue, since the Jewish leaders never placed a guard there, and there were no guards who claimed to have been stationed at the tomb. But secondly, it seems even more improbable that confronted with this palpable falsehood, their Jewish antagonists would, instead of exposing the guard of the tomb and denouncing it as such, proceed to create another fabrication even stupider, that the fictional guard had fallen asleep while the disciples broke into the tomb and absconded with the body. N.T. Wright also chimes in. But while the historian is also cautious about accepting obviously apologetic tales, raising an eyebrow, there are further considerations which make it very unlikely that this one was invented from scratch within the Christian community. For a start, it is implausible to suppose that the whole story would have been invented in the first place, let alone told and finally written down, unless there was already a rumor going around about the disciples had indeed stole the body. Finally, the telling of the story indicates well enough that the early Christians knew that the charge of stealing the body was one they were likely going to face, and it was preferable to tell the story of how the accusation had arisen, even at the risk of putting ideas into people's heads, rather than leaving the accusation unanswered. What happened was that they could not deny that the tomb was empty. The body of Jesus was missing. Now let's exit out here with this assertion counter-assertion. I hope you can follow along here. The Christians proclaim, Jesus the Lord is risen. The Jewish response, no, his disciples stole away his body. Christians, the guard of the tomb would have prevented such a theft. Jewish response, no, his disciples stole away his body while the guard slept. The Christians reply, no, the chief priest bribed the guard to say this. Did you catch that? You don't respond when the Christians say that the guard of the tomb would have prevented any such theft by saying, no, the fictional guard fell asleep. What you reply is, what guard?